of God. Paul loved to teach the Word of God. And when a preacher does not want to teach the Word of God, he becomes a clergyman. He becomes an administrator. He becomes a promoter. But he's not a man of God anymore. He's not a minister of the Word. And I've advised 2 or 3 men that have talked to me. One man says, I don't enjoy preaching anymore. And I says, for goodness sakes, get out of the ministry. You've got no business being in it today. Paul says that he wanted to come there to teach the Word of God. And he mentions in verse 12 the 4th reason. That is, that I may be comforted together with you by the mutual faith, both of you and me. In other words, he'd not only communicate something, but they'd communicate something to him. They'd be mutually blessed in the Word. Now, I had the privilege of speaking to 1,000 students, many of them from the Berkeley campus. I laid it on the line for those folk, I'll tell you that. Maybe a little hard with them at the very beginning, and I saw how they responded. And you know, they opened my eyes to a new world. I left that conference just singing, and I can't sing, but doing the best I could, just singing praises to God for the privilege of being there. May I say, Paul always was blessed in ministering to others, and that's what he's talking about here. Then he says, verse 13, he gives a 5th reason here. Now I would not have you ignorant, brethren, that oftentimes I purposed to come unto you, but was let or hindered, that I might have some fruit among you also, even as among other Gentiles. You see, it was a Gentile church, largely, and Paul wanted to have fruit among them by going there. Many of them were his converts, as we've said. And now we have verses 14 through 17. He gives us his 3 I ams. He says, first of all, in verse 14, I am debtor, both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the unwise. By the way, that word barbarian could refer to Romans as well as it could to your ancestors and mine that were beyond the boundary of the Roman Empire in that day. But Paul said he was debtor to them. Now, how did he get in debtor to the Greeks and to the barbarians? Had Paul made a bill at the Greek restaurant over in Athens when he was there and didn't pay it? Had Paul sent to Rome to get some neckties and shoes? That's what Rome is famous for today, and he hadn't paid his bill? No, he'd had no transaction with these people at all. But he had had a personal transaction with Jesus Christ. And that transaction put him in debt to every man, because the grace of God had been so bountifully bestowed upon him. Now it's put him in debt, not even to God, but it's made him a debtor out yonder to a lost world. Now I hear today Christians make this statement, I pay my honest debts. Do you? Not until every person has heard the gospel have you and I paid our honest debts. Now, I was telling a preacher friend of mine, we were driving way in the interior in Turkey, and that country's shut to the gospel. You get in trouble even propagandizing there. And as we were driving along, we came to a little town. Everything's in Turkish, and we felt very much as a stranger in a strange, strange land. But way down at the end of the street, there was a big sign. And you know what it said? Coca-Cola. And I said to this friend of mine, I says, isn't it interesting that Coca-Cola has done a better job of advertising and getting out its message in the few years it's had than the gospel has had in 1900 years? Quite interesting. We haven't paid our debt, friends, till they've all heard, and there are multitudes that have not heard. Paul says, I'm debtor, and that is another reason he wanted to come to Rome. Then he has another I am. So as much as in me is, I'm ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also. Now when he said I'm debtor, he said I'm ready to pay. Actually, He says, my side is ready. As Dr. Stifler says, he's master of his purpose, but not of his circumstance. And what he's saying here is, he's eager. He says, I'm eager to preach it. Oh, we need an enthusiasm and a high anticipation in our Christian life today in getting out the Word of God. Now, he says that I am debtor, and he says, I am ready. Then he says, in verse 16, and we actually come now to the two verses that are the key to this great epistle. He says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel. Now, the word of Christ is not in the better manuscripts. I'll leave it out. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For therein is not the righteousness, but a righteousness from God revealed, from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. Now let's look at that. This is his third I am. I am debtor. I am ready. I am not ashamed. I'm debtor, that's admission. I am ready, remission. I'm not ashamed, submission. That's the three missions of Paul. Admission, remission, and submission. Now he says here, I'm not ashamed. Why? Well, I walked down the streets of the ruins of Ephesus and looked at those ruins there of marble temples. But there's not a church that is ever built in Ephesus in that first century. You walk down the streets of the seven churches of Asia, and you see the ruins of gorgeous temples. In fact, in Ephesus, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world was there, the temple of Artemis, or Diana of the Ephesians. But no church. And there were a great many that were saying, well, Brother Paul hasn't come to Rome because of the fact that, after all, he's just preaching a message that goes to poor people, and he's preaching a message that it's not very prominent. There are no great temples built, no prestige connected with it. And therefore, Paul was ashamed to come to Rome. Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Now, why is he not ashamed of the gospel? It's the power. And the word here, power, is the word that we get our word dynamite from. It's dunamis. And it's dunamis power. And it's the kind of power that Dr. Vincent calls divine energy. And the important thing is, it in itself has an innate power. The gospel has power, my beloved, and it still has power. Now, it has power for very definite things. It's the power of God unto salvation. That's the end and the effect of the gospel. Salvation is the all-inclusive term of the gospel. And it simply means deliverance. And it has everything in it, from justification to glorification. It's both an act and a process. It's equally true. I have been saved, I am being saved, I shall be saved. And it's to everyone. It embraces the entire human race, irrespective of racial or religious barriers. It's personal, for it's directed to every individual, and whosoever will may come. It's to everyone, but it's also limited to those that believe. It's universal in scope, but it's limited to those who believe. And you have election and free will wrapped up here together in this statement. The only way of procuring salvation is by faith. Now, it's to the Jew first and to the Greek. Now, let me give you my interpretation of this. I'm of the opinion that when it says to the Jew first, it doesn't mean the Jew has priority today. I think the important thing is to make sure the Jew's on a par with the Gentile, and he ought to be put on the par as far as evangelism is concerned. But here it's chronological. The gospel went first to the Jew, chronologically. Had you been in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost, you'd have found out, my friend, that that was a Jewish meeting altogether.